Chapter 1, where maps begin to whisper. There was a time when the edges of the world were not empty. They were inhabited, not by certainty, not by knowledge, but by suggestion. Early maps did not simply describe the Earth. They interpreted it. Between coastlines and trade routes, in the spaces where information faded, something else appeared. Figures, shapes, creatures that did not belong to land, and did not fully belong to the sea. Sailors spoke of them long before they were drawn. Stories passed quietly between voyages, not always told in full, not always repeated the same way, and yet certain details remained consistent. Something moved beneath the surface. Something watched from a distance. Something followed without being seen directly. Cartographers, working far from the ocean, received these accounts not as facts, but not entirely as fiction either. They listened, they considered, and then, with ink and patience, they placed those stories onto the map. One of the earliest known examples can be traced to Olaus Magnus, whose work, the Carta Marina, did not leave the northern seas empty. It filled them with serpents that coiled between ships, with creatures whose size seemed to exceed proportion, with forms that were not entirely defined, as if even the act of drawing them required uncertainty. These were not decorations. They were placed deliberately, not to frighten, not to entertain, but to mark something that had been encountered, or perhaps something that could not be explained. In the cold waters of the north, stories gathered slowly. Sailors described shapes moving beneath ice, not breaking it, not disturbing it, only present, waiting. Their descriptions varied, but always returned to one detail: the size, too large to be dismissed, too unclear to be confirmed. And so, on the map, they appeared as curves, as coils, as something emerging, but never fully revealed. Further south, in warmer waters, the stories changed. Here, the sea was not silent. It shimmered. It moved with light. And within that movement, figures were seen, or believed to be seen. Women, perhaps, or something resembling them. Forms that appeared at a distance, then dissolved before clarity could arrive. These accounts did not remain isolated. They traveled from ship to ship, from port to port, and eventually to the desks of those who drew the world. Maps began to include them, not as central elements, but as quiet presences, a figure in the margin, a suggestion near a coastline, something that existed just beyond the reach of certainty. In the Mediterranean, older stories resurfaced, not new, ancient, echoes of beings described long before the age of navigation, hybrid forms, creatures that did not follow the rules of nature as it was understood. Half one thing, half another. They appeared in manuscripts, in fragments, in references that seemed incomplete. And yet, when sailors began to move through those same waters, similar descriptions emerged, not identical, but close enough to suggest continuity. Cartographers did not resolve these contradictions. They preserved them, placed them where knowledge ended, where the coastline faded into open sea, where the map no longer claimed certainty. There, the creatures remained, not fixed, not defined, but present. Over time, these figures became familiar, not because they were understood, but because they were expected. A map without them felt incomplete, as though it had ignored something that had been seen, or at least, something that had been reported, often enough, to deserve a place. Ships continued to sail. Stories continued to form, and each return to land brought with it something new, a detail, a movement, a shadow beneath the water that did not behave as water should. Not all of these accounts were recorded, not all were believed, but enough remained to shape the way the unknown was drawn. And so, maps began to whisper, not loudly, not clearly, but consistently. They did not declare what existed beyond the known world. They suggested it, and in that suggestion, they created a space where imagination and memory became difficult to separate. The ocean, after all, does not explain itself. It reflects, it conceals, and sometimes it reveals just enough to leave a trace, a shape, a movement, something that, once seen, cannot be entirely forgotten, even when it cannot be proven. And so the maps held these things, quietly, patiently, waiting for someone to look closer, to notice that the empty spaces were never truly empty, only unfinished. Chapter 2: The Shape Beneath the Surface. The stories did not begin as drawings. They began as interruptions. A line of travel, steady and predictable, would shift, not visibly, not immediately. Something beneath the surface would move, not with force, not with urgency, but with a presence that altered the water around it. Sailors rarely agreed on details, but they agreed on this. The sea, at times, behaved as if it contained something larger than itself. In the northern waters, where light remained low, and distances stretched longer than expected, a name began to repeat, not loudly, not formally, but often enough to become familiar. The creature did not appear in full. It was never seen entirely, only in parts. A curve, a movement, a surface that rose briefly, then disappeared. It would later be called the Kraken, but the name came after, long after. Before that, it was simply something beneath. Ships that encountered it did not always stop. Sometimes, nothing happened at all. Only a sense that movement below was following or observing. Other times, the water would shift, not violently, but enough to suggest that the ship was no longer alone. In its passage, descriptions varied. Some spoke of limbs that did not resemble any known creature. Others described a mass so large that its boundaries could not be determined. And some said nothing at all, because what they had seen did not translate into words. Further south, in calmer seas, the forms changed. Here, the water reflected light. It shimmered, and within that reflection, shapes appeared that seemed almost deliberate. Figures that held form for a moment, long enough to be recognized or misrecognized. Sailors spoke of beings that resembled humans, but did not behave like them. They did not approach directly. They did not remain. They appeared at the edge of perception, and then, without transition, they were gone. These accounts did not always reach the mapmakers, but when they did, they took on a different form. They became images, simplified, contained, placed carefully at the margins of knowledge. Among these figures was one that drew particular attention, a shape that did not belong to the natural order as it was understood. It was recorded in fragments, in descriptions that seemed uncertain, and yet it appeared more than once. A being that resembled a human figure, but carried the structure of something else. It would later be referred to as the sea monk, not because it was understood, but because it resembled something already known, a familiar form, applied to something unfamiliar. This was often the way. The unknown was described, not directly, but through comparison. In the deeper waters, where visibility ended quickly, and depth replaced distance, another presence was suggested, older than the maps, older than the voyages, a name that did not belong to a single region, a name that appeared in texts long before the sea, was crossed regularly. Leviathan. It was not drawn as often, perhaps because it resisted form, or because it belonged to something beyond mapping. Descriptions of it were less visual, more atmospheric, a force, a presence, something that did not need to be seen, to be acknowledged. Sailors did not claim to encounter it directly, not in the same way. They described other creatures, but they referred to it as though it existed beneath all other things, a deeper layer of the ocean itself. Maps, when they included it, did so cautiously, a curve too large to follow, a shadow without boundary, something that did not occupy space so much as define it, across different regions, different seas, different voyages. These accounts began to align, not precisely, but enough to suggest that the unknown was not entirely random, that certain patterns repeated, that certain shapes returned again and again. Cartographers did not resolve these patterns. They preserved them, placed them where the known world ended, where explanation gave way to possibility. Ships continued to move, stories continued to form, and with each return, the maps changed, slightly, not in structure, but in detail. A new curve added, a new figure placed, a new suggestion introduced into the space between certainty and absence. Over time, these creatures became expected, not believed, not dismissed, simply present, part of the language of the sea, a language that did not require agreement, only repetition. And in that repetition, something took shape, not fully, never fully, but enough to remain, enough to be drawn again, enough to be remembered, even when not seen. The ocean did not confirm these things. It did not deny them. It remained, as it always had, but within it, something moved, sometimes visible, sometimes not, and always just beyond what could be clearly understood. Chapter 3. Drawn into memory. The creatures did not remain only in stories. They found their way into ink, not all at once, not deliberately, but gradually, as if each retelling left a trace that could not be ignored. By the 16th century, maps had begun to change, not in their purpose, but in their willingness to include what could not be verified. Cartographers worked with fragments, reports brought back by sailors, descriptions repeated in ports, details that survived the journey, from memory to language, and then from language to image. In workshops across Europe, maps were constructed with care, coastlines were measured, distances calculated, but beyond those measured edges, Something else was added. Figures. Not random. Not decorative in the usual sense. They occupied space. With intention. On the Carta Marina. Created by Olaus Magnus. The northern seas were filled with motion. Creatures rose between ships. Some coiled. Some opened forms that suggested mouths, too large to belong to anything known. Others appeared only partially, as if the act of drawing them required restraint or uncertainty. The map did not explain them. It did not label them clearly. It allowed them to exist. In the same way, the sailors had allowed them to exist in their accounts. Elsewhere, another cartographer approached the unknown differently. Abraham Ortelius, in his Atlas Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, left more space empty, but not entirely. Where he included figures, they appeared with greater clarity, less distortion, as if attempting to stabilize what had been unstable in description. And yet, even in that clarity, something remained unresolved. The proportions. They did not align with known creatures. The behavior implied did not match natural patterns. Still, they were placed, not removed, not questioned openly. In different regions, the same process unfolded. In northern waters, the creatures carried weight, mass, a sense of depth that suggested something ancient. In southern waters, the forms were lighter, more fluid, less defined, but no less persistent. Across cultures, descriptions emerged that seemed separate, and yet, when placed side by side, they began to align. In Japan, records spoke of immense forms, rising briefly from the sea, not attacking, not interacting, only appearing, then returning to a depth that could not be measured. In Mediterranean accounts, older references resurfaced, fragments of earlier texts that described beings not fully understood even then, hybrid forms, creatures that existed between categories, not one thing, not another. These descriptions, though distant in origin, shared a quality. They resisted completion. No account provided the full image. No drawing captured the entire form. Always, something remained beyond the edge. Cartographers, whether consciously or not, reflected this. They did not finish the creatures. They suggested them, left parts undefined, allowed the viewer to complete the image without guidance. Over time, this approach created a pattern, not of certainty, but of recurrence. Certain shapes appeared again, curves that repeated across maps, made in different places, forms that resembled each other, without being identical. A coiling structure, a rising line, a surface breaking, without revealing what lay beneath. These were not copied directly. They emerged, as if drawn from the same source, without coordination. This created a question that was rarely asked directly, not because it was forbidden, but because it did not require asking. If different people, in different places, across different times, described something similar, what did that suggest? Nothing certain, nothing that could be proven, only that the unknown was not entirely without pattern. Ships continued to travel, stories continued to arrive, maps continued to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new figure here, a slight alteration there, each addition small, but together, forming something larger, a visual memory of what had been seen. or believed to have been seen. The ocean itself remained unchanged. It did not confirm these images. It did not correct them. It allowed them to exist, as it allows everything that passes across its surface and beneath it. For those who studied these maps, the creatures were not always the focus. They were peripheral, placed at the edges, and yet, it is often at the edges that the most persistent details remain, not central, not explained, but present, and in that presence, they created a quiet continuity, from one map to another, from one century to the next, a continuity that did not insist on belief, only on recognition, that something, whether real or imagined, had left enough of a trace to be drawn again, and again, and again, until the maps themselves became more than records. They became archives of uncertainty, places where the known world ended, and something else began, not fully formed, not fully understood, but never entirely absent. Chapter 4: The Pattern That Returns. At first, the stories appeared separate, different ships, different routes, different men, who had never met. And yet, when their accounts were placed side by side, a quiet alignment began to emerge, not in detail, in structure, the same hesitation before description, the same uncertainty in language, the same return to scale, larger than expected. These were not identical stories. They did not repeat word for word, but they followed a pattern that did not belong to storytelling. It belonged to recognition. In ship logs, often written with restraint, there were moments where the tone shifted. Briefly, a line would appear that did not match the rest, not emotional, but altered, a record of something seen that did not fit within navigation or weather. Then the log would continue, as if nothing had changed. These entries were rarely expanded, not because they lacked importance, but because they resisted it. They did not become full reports. They remained fragments. In one account, a vessel moving through northern waters recorded a disturbance beneath the surface. No impact, no damage, only a movement that followed the ship for longer than could be explained by current or drift. The description ended there. In another, from a different region entirely, a similar note appeared. Again, no conclusion, only the observation that something remained below, longer than it should have. These fragments did not reference each other. They existed independently, and yet, when read together, they formed a rhythm, a repetition that was not exact, but consistent across time. This rhythm did not disappear. It resurfaced in later voyages, with more precise instruments, with more structured recording. The language changed, but the pattern did not. Descriptions became more careful, more restrained, but still returned to the same points. Something seen briefly, something felt indirectly, something present, without confirmation. In certain regions, this repetition was stronger, not more dramatic, more consistent. The same types of observations appeared again and again, not always in the same place, but within the same conditions. Calm water, clear visibility, extended distance, moments when the sea should have revealed everything. And yet, those were the moments when something else appeared, or seemed to. Cartographers, working from these accounts, began to notice it as well, not consciously at first, but through accumulation. A figure placed on one map would resemble a figure placed on another, not copied, but similar enough to suggest a shared source, the same curvature, the same emergence from water, the same partial visibility, as if the creature was never meant to be seen entirely, only enough to be recognized. Over time, this created a quiet tension, not between belief and disbelief, but between coincidence and repetition. How many times could something be described in similar ways before it formed a pattern? And when does a pattern become something else? Sailors did not ask this directly. They did not gather to compare accounts in a systematic way, but they listened. And when a story resembled something they had heard before, they did not dismiss it. They paused, just briefly, as if recognizing a signal they had encountered in another form. This recognition was never confirmed, never stated, but it remained, in the way certain stories were not questioned, in the way certain details were accepted without explanation, in the way silence followed specific descriptions. The ocean, unchanged in its surface, continued to conceal its depth, but within that concealment, something repeated, not visibly, not continuously, but enough to leave a trace that moved from observation to memory, from memory to record, from record to map, and back again. A cycle that did not require confirmation, only continuation. This is what made the creatures different from other myths. They did not belong only to imagination. They returned, not clearly, not fully, but repeatedly. And in that repetition, they created something that felt less like invention and more like a signal, not sent, not received, but encountered at intervals, under conditions that could not be controlled, and once encountered, difficult to ignore, even if impossible to define. The maps recorded this without explanation. They did not claim that something existed. They suggested that something had been seen often enough to remain, and so the figures stayed, not because they were understood, but because they returned again and again and again, until the question itself became part of the map, not written, but present. Is this imagination or recognition? Chapter 5: Instruments and Echoes. As maps became more precise, the space for uncertainty began to narrow. Coastlines sharpened, distances aligned, navigation improved. The unknown did not disappear, but it was expected to. With better instruments, with clearer methods, with records that could be verified, the sea was meant to become measurable, defined, predictable. And yet, something remained, not in the same form, not drawn as before, but present, in another way. Ship logs grew more detailed, times were recorded, coordinates fixed, conditions described with care, language shifted, less interpretation, more observation, and within that language, the pattern continued, not as image, as interruption. A sequence of entries would move steadily, wind, course, speed, and then a single line would appear that did not belong, a deviation, not of direction, but of description. Something observed that did not fit within the system being used. Then, the record would return to normal, as if nothing had happened. In one account, from northern waters, a vessel equipped with improved instruments recorded a disturbance beneath it. No collision, no visible cause. The depth reading shifted briefly, then corrected. The entry remained. No explanation followed. In another log, from a distant region, a similar anomaly appeared. Not identical, but close enough to be noticed. If the records were compared, they were not systematically. And yet, over time, these moments accumulated, a quiet archive of observations that resisted classification. The age of certainty had not removed the pattern, it had refined it. Where once there were creatures, there were now signals. Where once there were shapes, there were now deviations. But the structure remained. Something appeared, briefly, under conditions that should have revealed everything. Then it was gone. In scientific expeditions, where documentation was stricter, the language became even more careful. Words like unidentified, transient, irregular, descriptions that did not commit, descriptions that allowed for recording without conclusion. And yet, even within that restraint, the same elements returned. A presence below, a movement that did not match known currents, a form that could not be resolved, not always seen, sometimes only felt, through the structure of the vessel, through instruments that registered change, without identifying its source. These moments did not define the voyage. They did not alter its course, but they remained within the record, quietly, persistently. Cartographers, now working with more accurate data, began to remove the creatures, not all at once. Gradually, the margins cleared, the figures disappeared, the maps became cleaner, more authoritative. And yet, in that clarity, something was lost. Not knowledge, but suggestion. The visual language of the unknown was replaced by absence. But absence does not eliminate presence. It conceals it. Where once a figure had been drawn, there was now empty space. But the reports that had inspired those figures had not vanished. They remained in logs, in notes, in fragments that did not reach the map. The signal had not stopped. It had changed form, no longer visible. In the same way, no longer expressed through image, but still returning at intervals, under conditions that could not be fully controlled. The question shifted. Not what is it, but why does it repeat? Why do similar observations appear across time, even as the method of recording changes? Why does refinement not eliminate them? Why does precision still leave space for something unmeasured? These questions were not central. They did not guide the work, but they remained at the edges, where they had always been, and in that position, they continued to accumulate. A pattern, not of belief, but of recurrence. A signal, not sent, not received, but encountered, again and again, even as the maps grew silent, even as the drawings disappeared, even as the language became more exact. The ocean did not change. It did not reveal more. It did not conceal less. It remained, and within it, something continued to appear just beyond what could be fully understood, not as myth, not as certainty, but as repetition. And repetition, over time, becomes difficult to ignore, even when it cannot be explained. Chapter 6, Signals in the Modern Sea. The drawings disappeared first, then the language changed, but the sea did not become empty. With the arrival of modern navigation, the expectation was clear. Everything would be measured, depth mapped, currents modeled, movement predicted. There would be no space left for uncertainty. And yet, uncertainty did not leave. It adapted. Ships became quieter, stronger, more precise. They moved with intention, guided by systems that did not rely on sight. Below the surface, new methods extended perception. Sound replaced vision. Echoes mapped the unseen. Distances calculated through return. And for a time, this seemed to work. The ocean began to resolve into layers, into shapes that could be described, into patterns that could be trusted. But then, within those patterns, something appeared, not as form, as interruption, a signal that did not align with expectation. In sonar readings, where depth should remain stable, a shape would emerge, not fixed, not consistent, present for a moment, then gone, too large to be noise, too brief to be tracked. Operators marked these moments carefully, not as discovery, as anomaly, a word that allows recording without explanation. These anomalies did not repeat on command. They did not follow routes. They appeared under conditions that seemed ordinary. Calm water, stable readings, no interference. And then, a shift, a return that suggested something beneath had answered, not deliberately, not clearly, but enough to register. Submarines, moving in silence, encountered similar moments, not visually, through structure, a pressure that did not match depth, a movement nearby that did not produce sound in the expected way. Reports described it cautiously, not as presence, as discrepancy, something not accounted for in the model being used. And then, as before, nothing. The readings normalized. The water returned to its expected state. The voyage continued. These events did not define the mission. They were not pursued. They were noted, filed, placed within systems designed to organize information. But organization does not resolve everything. Across different oceans, different crews, different technologies, similar descriptions appeared, not identical, but aligned. A temporary shape, a brief signal, a presence that could not be sustained long enough to be identified. The pattern had not disappeared. It had become more subtle, less visible, but still present. In earlier centuries, the unknown was drawn. In later ones, it was described. Now, it was detected, indirectly, through systems that extended perception beyond the human eye. And yet, even with that extension, something remained, just beyond reach, not fully captured, not fully understood, only encountered at intervals, without warning, without repetition. that could be predicted. The ocean, measured in greater detail than ever before, still contained spaces that did not resolve, not large spaces, not entire regions, moments, brief, contained, but persistent. In those moments, the same question returned, not spoken, not written directly, but present. If everything is being measured, why does something still appear that cannot be measured fully? If the unknown has been reduced, why does it continue to return? Not as myth, not as image, but as signal. A signal that does not declare itself, that does not remain, that does not repeat, in a way that allows capture, only enough to suggest that it exists, and then it is gone, leaving behind a record, a trace, a single deviation within an otherwise stable system. Over time, these traces accumulate, not into proof, into pattern, a pattern that does not resolve, that does not conclude, that continues quietly beneath the surface of what is known, and in that continuation, something remains, not defined, not confirmed, but present, in the same way it has always been, from the first maps to the latest instruments, unchanged in its nature, only in the way it is perceived. Chapter 7. What has always been there? The maps changed, the language changed, the instruments improved, but the pattern did not disappear. It moved from drawing to description, from description to detection, but it remained within the same structure. Something appears briefly, without full form, without confirmation, and then it is gone, leaving only a trace across centuries. This trace has taken different shapes: a coiling figure on a map, a fragment in a ship's log, a deviation in a sonar reading, different expressions, the same interruption. If these moments are placed together, not by time, not by location, but by structure, a continuity begins to emerge. Not a clear line, but a presence, something that does not belong to a single era, something that does not depend on belief, something that does not require to be seen fully in order to be encountered. In earlier centuries, sailors did not question whether such things could exist. They described what they experienced as best they could. When language failed, they turned to image. When image failed, they left space. Modern observation does not allow for such space. Everything is expected to be defined, measured, explained, and yet, even within that expectation, the same structure persists. A moment that does not align, a signal that does not resolve, a presence that does not remain long enough to be understood. This is what connects the earliest maps to the latest recordings, not the creatures themselves, but the recurrence of something that resists completion across different oceans, different centuries, different methods. The same type of interruption continues to appear, not often enough to define, not rarely enough to ignore. Between those two states, it remains unresolved. There are explanations. There are always explanations. Unknown species, unusual currents, instrumental error. Each of these accounts for something, but not for everything. not for the repetition, not for the alignment of structure across time, not for the way. These moments resemble each other, without direct connection. If it were random, it would not repeat with such consistency. If it were known, it would not remain unresolved. And so, it exists in a space between, not fully outside understanding, not fully within it, a boundary that shifts, but does not disappear. The ocean, despite all attempts to define it, still contains this boundary, not everywhere, not always, but enough to remain part of it, enough to return. There is no single point where this began, no origin that can be identified, only a continuity that extends backward and forward at the same time, as if the pattern does not belong to history, but to something that exists alongside it, unchanged by the way it is observed, unchanged by the tools used to observe it, only encountered differently, at the edge of perception, at the limit of what can be recorded, at the moment just before understanding, and just after. In that space, the same presence remains, not named, not defined, but familiar, in the way something becomes familiar when it has been encountered many times, even if never clearly. The maps once gave it form, the records gave it language, the instruments give it signal, but none of these contain it fully. They only reflect what passes through them, briefly, and then disappears. The question does not end. It does not resolve. It remains, not as a problem, but as a condition, that something beneath the surface of what is known continues to appear, not always visible, not always measurable, but present in the same way it has always been. Chapter 8, The Space Between. In the end, nothing is confirmed. The maps remain, the records remain, the signals remain, but none of them resolve into certainty. What they offer instead is continuity, a quiet persistence that moves through time without needing to be defined. Early cartographers left space for it, not because they understood it, but because they recognized that something belonged there, at the edges, where knowledge ended, but observation did not. They filled that space with forms that suggested presence, not precise, but deliberate. Later, those forms disappeared, replaced by clarity, by clean lines, by measured absence. And yet, the absence was never complete, because the reports continued, not in images, in fragments, a line in a log, a note in a report, a signal in a system that did not fully align with expectation, each fragment small, easily set aside, easily explained, and yet, together, they form something larger, not a conclusion, a pattern that does not insist, that does not demand recognition, only presence. Across centuries, this presence has remained remarkably consistent, not in appearance, but in structure. A moment of interruption, a brief deviation, a return to normal, that arrives too quickly, something encountered, then gone, leaving only the awareness that it occurred. This is the space between what is known and what is not a boundary, a transition, a place where certainty begins to loosen, but does not fully disappear, where observation continues, even when understanding does not. The ocean holds this space without effort. It does not clarify. It does not conceal intentionally. It simply remains as it is, and within it, something moves, not constantly, not predictably, but enough to be noticed, enough to return. There are explanations. There are always explanations. They provide structure. They offer resolution, but they do not remove the pattern entirely, because the pattern does not rely on interpretation. It exists before interpretation begins and continues after it ends. This is why it remains, not as proof, not as myth, but as possibility. A possibility that does not close, that does not demand belief, only attention. The maps, though silent now, still carry traces of it, in older lines, in forgotten figures, in the decision to play something where nothing was certain. The records, though precise, still reflect it, in moments that do not align, in entries that do not expand, in the quiet return to normal that follows without explanation. The instruments, though advanced, still detect it, in signals that appear and disappear without pattern, in anomalies that resist repetition, in data that cannot be fully resolved. Each of these points to the same thing, not directly, but consistently, that something exists within the unknown. That does not disappear. When the unknown is reduced, it shifts, it adapts, but it remains. And so, the question does not end. It changes. It becomes quieter, less defined, but no less present. What was once drawn as a creature is now recorded as a signal. What was once imagined is now measured, partially, but never completely. And in that incompleteness, something continues, not hidden, not revealed, only there, in the same place it has always been, beneath the surface, at the edge of perception, in the space between what can be known and what can only be encountered. That space remains unchanged, unresolved, and perhaps it is not meant to be otherwise, because some things do not exist to be understood, only to be noticed, and once noticed, to be remembered, not clearly, but enough to return again